I'm James Miranda.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 13. Occupation. Augusta, Maine State Legislature Office. There was still snow on the sides of the road as the armored column turned off Interstate 95 to make their way to the state capitol building in downtown Augusta. 5 hours ago, Lieutenant Colonel Sigurd Broigard's Norwegian Telemark Battalion had crossed into the northernmost U.S. state with high hopes that they'd be able to capture the state in a bloodless coup. They had been told that a large percentage of the American people wanted the UN to liberate them. The send-off speech they'd watched from President-elect Marshal Tate led Broigard and the men and women of his battalion to believe that the American people would welcome them with open arms, that only a fringe element of hardcore Sax supporters would give them problems. However, Broigard's battalion hadn't traveled 10 minutes into America before they'd run into their first sign of trouble. A group of civilians had created a blockade on I-95 around the small town of Island Falls. Not wanting to create a major incident, several of his men and some New York Civil Defense Force militiamen tried to talk with the truckers to convince them to move off the road. For 10 minutes the parties talked. Meanwhile, the battalion was getting backed up on the road. Just when Broigard was about to order one of his tanks to bulldoze their way through the blockade, the truckers agreed to move. They were guided off the road and copies of their driver's licenses were taken. They were told if they caused any further troubles or attempted to delay any future UN forces from using the highway, they'd be arrested and detained. An hour later, they came across another similar roadblock around the city of Howland, just north of Bangor. Seeing how they had been able to de-escalate the last blockade, Broigard figured they'd try talking to the group and see if they could do it again. 5 minutes into the impromptu meeting in the center of the road, someone from the roadblock suddenly fired a shot at one of his soldiers. In that instant, one of the truckers who'd been talking to one of Broigard's lieutenants pulled out his pistol and summarily shot the lieutenant in the face. "Open fire!" ordered Broigard. He quickly crouched behind the door of the vehicle he was nearest to and started firing at the Americans, aiming first for the man who'd executed his lieutenant. For the next 5 minutes, a running gun battle had taken place between his lead company and the 24 or so truckers and militiamen manning the roadblock. Finally, one of the Norwegian Leopard 2 tanks fired a couple of rounds into the big rigs that were blocking them. The tank had then plowed forward, pushing the fiery wrecks off the road so Telemark Battalion could continue to Augusta. After that brief but violent confrontation, Broigard put his head in his hands as he sat in the back of his CV-90 infantry fighting vehicle. He was pretty sure at that point that they had been misled regarding the type of reception they would receive from the American people. Our fight isn't with them, though, he thought. The government was the real source of conflict. At that point, he hatched a plan and sent a small scout unit ahead of them on some of the less traveled country roads that some of the NYCDF volunteers knew about. Their goal was to locate and detain the governor until they arrived with the rest of the battalion. Broigard wanted to personally talk with the governor and see if he could work out some sort of agreement with him regarding the occupation. The last thing he wanted his battalion to have to do was occupy the major cities in the state. If he could negotiate some sort of arrangement with the state government, then they might be able to get things back to normal without having to use a heavy hand to govern them. Glancing down at his watch, Broigard saw it was now 11:05 a.m., nearly lunchtime. He shook his head in disappointment at how long it had taken them to go this far. He had hoped he would have been rolling into Augusta around 9 a.m., and they would have, if they hadn't had to deal with those 2 roadblocks. He sighed, realizing it wasn't going to help anything to dwell on the negative aspects of the situation. He found himself grateful for the company of tanks traveling with his battalion. Those 68-ton tanks would make for an invaluable intimidation factor if things didn't work out well with the governor. Eventually, they began their drive through the downtown of the city of Augusta. Despite the chilly temperature, many people came out of their stores, offices, and homes to see his column of armored vehicles as they rolled through their city. Broigard made sure to have their Norwegian flag tied to a couple of the antennas of his vehicles, so they'd know they were part of the UN force. Suddenly his vehicle lurched to a stop, and the vehicle commander announced, "We've arrived." When the rear door opened, Broigard got out and stretched his legs and back. He'd been cooped up in that death trap long enough. While he performed a few basic stretches, he caught the eye of some of the civilians nearby. They didn't look friendly. They definitely view us as invaders, not liberators, he realized. One of the young captains who had arrived with the advance party approached him. "Sir, if you'll follow me, we have the governor and the head of the state police and local police chiefs in a conference room waiting for you." As he approached the Maine State House, with its 2 tiers of columns in the front and copper-topped dome, Broigard had to admit it was a beautiful building. Not as old or ornate as the government buildings in his own nation, but impressive nonetheless. Eventually, he was led to a conference room that was being guarded by a handful of his soldiers. Broigard nodded toward them, acknowledging their presence. He took in a deep breath, held it for a second, and then let it out as he marched in to deal with the civilian government officials. "Good afternoon, Mr. Governor," Broigard said in his best English. He held his shoulders back and stood as erect as possible, utilizing his imposing 6'5" frame for all it was worth. The governor, the head of the state police, and the local chief of police all stood. However, none of them said a word to him or extended their hands to shake his. They didn't appear to be pleased to see him. He couldn't blame them, but he also didn't care. He just hoped he could find a way to cut a deal with them so his force could get back on the road. They had more objectives to meet. He simply motioned for them to take their seats, which they did. "Well, my name is Lieutenant Colonel Sigurd Broigard. I'm a battalion commander in the Norwegian Army, part of the United Nations Peacekeeping Force. I understand that my presence, and the presence of my soldiers, may not be wanted or appreciated in your city, state, or country. But here we are. All of us are doing our part in this great play they call life." Before he could say another word, the head of police cut him off. "Colonel, I don't want any of your men to die, so I suggest you take your force and go back to Canada before more people are killed." Smiling at the bluntness of the man before him, Broigard replied, "Thank you for your concern. I do appreciate it. I, too, don't want any of my soldiers to die. Nor do I want any of your citizens to be killed. Surely you heard about the 2 separate roadblocks my battalion encountered on I-95 as we made our way to Augusta." He tried to read their faces to see how much they knew about the situation. "I heard one of your tanks killed a handful of people north of Bangor," replied the governor angrily. Broigard nodded. "You heard correctly. A small band of either militia or National Guardsmen, I don't know which they were, decided they would try and impede my tanks from using the interstate by blocking it with several trucks. While we were trying to negotiate with them, someone fired a shot, and one of my soldiers was hit. Then they opened fire on the rest of my men, and we defended ourselves." He paused for a moment. "I'm meeting with you because I'm seeking a way to avoid killing each other," he explained. "Will you help with that, Governor?" The governor looked conflicted. When he failed to speak up right away, the police chief broke in. "If you want to avoid further bloodshed, Colonel, then I suggest you turn around and go back to Canada. Just because you've made it down here today doesn't mean you won't be attacked later tonight, tomorrow morning, or any other opportune time our citizens see fit. I don't think you Europeans appreciate exactly how many of our citizens are armed and ready to defend their homes and cities." Beauregard sighed softly. This was precisely what he wanted to avoid. He'd had his suspicions that invading America wouldn't work. Looking at the police chief, he replied, "Chief Wilkes, I don't like this situation any more than you do, but I have my orders. Now, I've been given a lot of latitude in how to handle things. I can mostly let you guys run everything just as you have before our arrival, or I can replace you with those who will accommodate my forces. Those who don't want to cooperate will be taken and placed in a separate holding camp until we can determine they no longer present a danger to themselves or those around them. Those individuals who are caught attacking or fighting my forces, or others of the United Nations peacekeeping force, will be summarily shot. We've been instructed to carry out public executions as a means of deterring future acts of aggression." He paused for a moment as he saw the looks of horror and then contempt wash over their faces. "I think these orders are abhorrent, but they are my orders," he said. "I would rather not have to implement them. I'm asking for you to help me make sure I don't have to. If we're all lucky, this whole situation will be concluded in a few days, when President-elect Marshal Tate is sworn in as your new president. Let's all try to work together and make sure everyone survives this turbulent time." The governor looked like he was going to be sick. He mumbled to himself a few times as he shook his head. "I'll do my best to try and keep things calm, Colonel," he finally managed to say. "But you have to do your best to keep your soldiers out of sight and off the streets. The more military presence the people see, the more likely they are to do something stupid." Beauregard smiled. "Thank you, Governor. I knew we could work something out." He turned his attention to the police chiefs. "I understand that your state and federal government keep a register of persons who own firearms. My captain here," he said as he snapped his fingers, "would like to access that list. We have a special unit that will start confiscating personally owned firearms straight away. We'll also be putting out an announcement that anyone who willingly turns in a firearm will be given a 1-ounce gold coin in exchange for their weapon. If a person knows someone is illegally keeping a firearm and they turn that person in, they will get a 1-ounce gold coin for each weapon confiscated." Before Beauregard could go any further, the head of the state police stood up and held his hands straight out in front of him. "You might as well arrest me now. Let me be the first person you arrest, because I won't surrender my personal firearms, nor will I willingly hand over a list of our citizens who legally own them. I can assure you of one thing, Colonel. No one in our state will willingly allow themselves to be disarmed like this. You'll unleash a torrent of violence the likes of which you can't even imagine against your soldiers. You may think you had it easy waltzing into Augusta today, but rest assured, Colonel, today was the easiest day of this occupation you'll ever have. The citizens of my country are going to wage an insurgency on you like nothing you've ever seen, and I'll gladly be the first martyr to rally them to that very cause." He spoke with such vitriol and hatred, it nearly caused Beauregard to recoil. "Cuff him and take him out of the building, now," Beauregard ordered. His men quickly complied. This might be a bit harder than I first thought, Beauregard realized. From Fox News Online. Following the invasion of the northern states by the United Nations, the National Rifle Association sent out an email to their millions of subscribers, urging their members to be prepared to take up arms in defense of the country. We are urging our members to seek out their local Army National Guard stations first and offer their services, they write. If the local Guard unit doesn't need assistance, we recommend that all NRA members across the country band together to form militias to help defend the country from the coming foreign invasion. There has been no comment from the White House, Homeland Security, or the Department of Defense on this statement, other than to say they hope this situation can be diffused and resolved shortly. In a related note, the Department of Defense has asked for all able-bodied men and women to report to their local military recruiter's office and volunteer for service in defense of their country. Bellingham, Washington. 2 days after the UN forces invaded the U.S., Jake Bain received a cryptic call on the radio he'd been given at the armory. He was supposed to meet Major Slevin at a park roughly 12 miles from his cabin. Jake felt his hands sweating against the steering wheel. He was even more nervous than usual, knowing UN military convoys were using a lot of the roads nearby. So far, he hadn't run into any of them, but that didn't mean he wouldn't. After an uneventful trip, Jake arrived at a park that was eerily empty. A fresh layer of snow had fallen the night before, and without another soul around, the stark scene seemed somewhat surreal. He parked his truck near Slevin's and walked over to the Major. "It's good to see you, sir," Jake said. He glanced around anxiously. It seemed too quiet here. "So, what did you want to meet about? First off, don't call me sir anymore. Just call me Al." Jake nodded, and the two of them began to walk down one of the marked trails. They didn't say much for the first 10 minutes. They just moved deeper into the woods. When they reached a hill that Al seemed to be aiming for, he suddenly stopped. "In another couple of days, half of the state will be under the control of the UN," he explained. "I hope you got those supplies." Jake nodded. "What I need to know is, how soon can you start building some IEDs for me?" Major Slevin asked. Jake was silent for a moment as he calculated his answer. "That depends on what kind of IEDs you want. Do you want ones for blowing up some bridges or nicking a convoy? Or do you want to blow up some UN foot patrols?" "For the moment, let's stick to the convoys. I don't want to risk civilian casualties if we can avoid it." "Do you want command wire control, infrared, or remote control?" Jake asked next. Slevin snorted at the question. "Man, I used to hate IEDs. Now you're asking me which one of those nasty little death devices I want." He ran his fingers through his hair. "Let's start with command wire first. As they adapt, we'll adapt. Let's not give away our toolbox of what we have available to us right away. This could be a long insurgency." Jake smiled. "I agree. I'll make the bombs. When I make the command wire, I'll give you guys at least 200 feet. I'll show you how to increase that if you want, but if I start making these half-mile-long command wire detonators, I'm going to run out of wiring." Slevin nodded. "Not a problem. We'll get the wiring. Don't worry about a long command wire. Just give us 50 feet, and we'll rig them up the way we need them. How many bombs can you make us in a week?" "Well, since you asked, I have 4 in my truck right now I can give you. They're each about 2 pounds of C4, wrapped in about 4 inches of roofing nails, nuts, and washers. Best I could come up with on short notice. I could crank out a lot more if you can get me some artillery shells or mortars, but if I have to stick to the C4, there's only going to be so many I can dish out." "Oh, man. I knew you were the right guy for the job," Slevin said, slapping Jake on the shoulder. "Okay, here's what I want you to do. We'll send you a coded message on Tuesdays at 1000 hours and 1700 hours. You'll either be told to bring the IEDs to a location on Thursday, or you'll be told to bring them to Miller's Quick Lube on Saturdays. You bring however many IEDs you're able to build, and we'll take them. If I can come across some mortar or artillery shells, I'll find a way to get them to you. Got it?" "Sure thing, Al. Piece of cake," Jake replied nonchalantly. They both chuckled. After stitching up some last-minute details, they spent the next 10 minutes walking back to their trucks. Once the transfer had been successfully made of the completed IEDs to Slevin's truck, they went their separate ways. Port of Balboa, Panama. Lieutenant General Song Puk-Chuan of the 20th PLA Army Group stood in one of the control towers that overlooked the massive port. A broad smile spread across his face. Without a shot fired, his forces had captured the entire port, and even now they were offloading his heavy armor and air defense equipment. The capture of the Panama Canal was critical to their strategy of dividing the U.S. Navy and clearing the Pacific of enemy threats. Now that the conflict had officially started, it was imperative that his ground force get offloaded and finish capturing the rest of the country. In the coming weeks, a steady gravy train of supplies would begin to show up, bound for Mexico and the U.S. southern border. One of his aides appeared next to him. "General, you said to let you know when General Loa arrived. His plane just landed." General Song nodded at the news. He took one last look at the 2 roll-on, roll-off freighters being unloaded, and then turned to head down the stairs back to the ground floor. A vehicle was waiting to take him over to the airport nearby. As he exited the control tower, General Song felt the warm, moist air hit his skin. It was strangely comforting, certainly much more pleasant than the hostile winter weather he undoubtedly would have been feeling back in Beijing. A lieutenant held his door open as he approached the blacked-out SUV. General Song directed his driver to take him over to the airport. He wanted to greet the Air Force counterpart, who was going to be responsible for airlifting over many of his soldiers. With the war now raging along the American-Canadian border, it was a race against time to get his force assembled and ready for action. When they pulled up to the Albrook International Airport, a pair of civilian guards saw their vehicle and the special placard they had in the windshield and waved them past the gate. Once inside the facility, they drove over to where several military transport aircraft were parked. As they approached the large aircraft, General Song observed a lot of military personnel getting one of the Type 95 self-prepared anti-aircraft artillery guns set up. Another crew was hard at work getting a lone HQ-9 surface-to-air missile system unpacked. They'd hopefully have the system set up and running in a few more hours. Although he didn't anticipate any immediate threats, Song wanted to have their air defense systems operational as soon as possible. General Song continued to scan the area until he saw the man he was looking for, pointing toward part of the airport. "Driver, head over to that lean-looking man near the airport officials," he ordered. Once they pulled up to him, Song's driver stopped and swiftly hopped out to get the door. General Song exited the vehicle and walked up to his Chinese Air Force counterpart. "General Loa, it's good to see you. How was the flight over?" he asked pleasantly. Lieutenant General Loa turned to face him, sweat running down his anxious-looking face. "It was good, General Song, but we have much work that needs to be done. Has your equipment arrived in the port?" Song nodded. "It has. Our equipment is being offloaded and made ready. Are the planes carrying my men still on schedule?" "They are. They should start to arrive in the coming hours," General Loa answered. Then, As if he anticipated a question about how long all of this was going to take, he continued. As you requested, the men of the 60th Mechanized Infantry Brigade will arrive first, followed by the Air Defense Brigade, and then the 16th Armor Brigade. Those are the soldiers slated to arrive today. The rest of your force will arrive over the coming 3 days. It's a long commute for our planes to have to make, General. Perrysburg, Ohio. Adam Ruttman sat in his recliner with his wife, watching the news in utter shock and horror. We're really being invaded, he thought. He really couldn't believe it had come to this. Do you think Jimmy is up there? Asked his wife Lucinda with a fearful look on her face. You know, fighting in Detroit? Lifting his beer to his lips, Adam finished off the bottle before he responded. I don't know, honey. His unit was up in Detroit, though, so I'd have to think he probably is. Oh, Adam, what are we going to do? What if they make it all the way down here to Perrysburg? What do we do then? She asked, clearly fighting back tears. Adam could understand why his wife was so distraught. Their nephew, Jimmy, had become kind of a son to them, and it now appeared that he was in harm's way. Unfortunately, Adam and Lucinda hadn't been able to have children themselves, but they'd been very involved in the lives of the 3 sons Adam's brother had had. Jimmy, the oldest of the 3, had always said he wanted to be a soldier when he grew up, and had joined the army as soon as he'd turned 18. Now it looked like his unit was going to be turned into a mere speed bump between the UN Army and the rest of the American Midwest. You should give Rich a call tomorrow, Lucinda said. He'd know what to do. Then she got up and headed off to another room, clearly too distraught to watch the news any longer. Adam sighed. He knew he needed to do something. He thumbed through his smartphone until he found the number he was looking for in his contacts. Richard McVeigh was an old Army buddy of his. They'd been part of the same platoon in the 101st Airborne during the First Gulf War back in '91. Adam had gotten out of the military shortly after the war, but Richard had stayed in and made it a career. They'd kept in touch over the years, especially once Richard retired from the Army and settled in about an hour away. His friend was a bit over the top at times as a prepper and conspiracy theorist, but Adam cut him some slack since his extreme views worked well with his business. Richard ran a small outdoor rifle range outside of town. Perrysburg was just south of Toledo, so Rich maintained a lot of contracts with the neighboring city's police departments. His business had become a full-service shooting range and training facility for local police and SWAT teams and gun enthusiasts. Rich's hard work had paid off well for him, and when he made his firearm and ammunition purchases, he mostly did so through Adam's store, which had been a godsend on more than one occasion. The phone rang once before Adam heard his friend's voice. Adam! Just the man I needed to talk with. I was literally just about to dial you, Rich said with a chuckle. Joining in the laughter himself, Adam replied, I think we need to talk. Can you stop by the shop tomorrow, say around 8 a.m.? Yeah, I can do that, Rich answered. Don't you open at 10, though? Normally, yes, but I think we should talk before I open the shop. I have a feeling I'm going to be super busy tomorrow, if you catch my drift. You're telling me. I've had half a dozen people calling me tonight, asking what's going on, like I have some bat phone to the White House. The two of them laughed again before they hung up. They'd talk more tomorrow in person. Adam arrived at his storefront around 7 a.m. After letting himself in, he quickly locked the door and rearmed the security system. He made sure one of the AR-15s in the office was loaded, and another, under the front counter, was also ready. He also put his level 4 body armor on. He wasn't messing around today. He knew he'd have a lot of scared, concerned people coming in to buy him out of everything he had. He just wanted to make sure no one tried to rob him. He double-checked his electronic payment devices to make sure they were still working. Thankfully, they did, which meant he could still accept people's debit and credit cards. Steadily, he got the rest of his shop ready. 2 of his other employees showed up early, just as he had requested. Adam had them doing an inventory of what ammo they had in the warehouse and how many rifles and magazines they had. He also had them each open carry a sidearm and wear body armor as well. When his other 2 employees arrived right before the store would open, he'd place them as guards outside the front entrance. He didn't expect trouble, but he sure wasn't going to sit around and allow an attack to happen either. At 8 o'clock, Adam got a call. Looking at the caller ID on his smartphone, he saw it was Richard. "Rich, you out back?" Adam asked. "Yeah, just got here. You do want me to come to the back door, right?" "Yes. Knock twice, no more. I'll let you in. Is anyone outside yet? Do you see anyone else milling around?" There was a pause for a second on the other line before his friend replied. "Not that I can see. Honestly, it's pretty quiet outside right now. That'll probably change in another hour as people start to hit the stores." A minute later, Adam heard the 2 knocks. Before he opened the door, he disabled the alarm and then pulled his pistol out and had it ready. When Rich walked in, he held his hands up in mock surrender. "Whoa, cowboy. You're the one who invited me, remember?" Adam nodded and holstered his sidearm. "Sorry. You can't be too careful these days, not with all that's happening. Come with me back to my office." He locked the back door, and the 2 of them walked to the other side of the store, where Adam's personal office was located. When they walked in, Adam closed the door and took a seat behind his desk. "So, Adam, why'd you drag my butt all the way into town? I've got a ton of people coming out to the range later this afternoon." Looking his friend over with a hard stare, Adam finally said, "Rich, I know you run in some hardcore prepper circles, and that's cool with me. I sell a lot of firearms and other stuff to that crowd." Rich nodded. Adam continued, "First, I want you to know that I'm going to be burning all the records of people who've purchased a firearm at this store. I'm not about to let them fall into the hands of the UN and their goon squads. So tell your people if they bought a gun from me, they're safe. Second, I'm not doing any more background checks. I don't want any of that data to fall into the wrong hands when they get here. I'm not sure if you saw the news this morning, but it looks like our boys are getting their butts kicked around Detroit. That means it won't be long before they're on their way to Toledo." Rich held up a hand. "I get it, Adam. We all do. We know what's coming. You want to know if you can help, right?" Adam didn't say anything for a second. Then he nodded. "What can I do?" he asked in a soft voice. Rich leaned in and pulled a notepad out of the breast pocket of his jacket. "We're putting together a militia of the folks that regularly shoot at the range. We don't really need rifles or even ammo, but there are other supplies we could use." "If I have it, it's yours," Adam replied. Smiling, Rich handed him the list of what they needed. It consisted mostly of camping gear, but there were some other interesting items on the unassuming scrap of paper. Black powder, signal flares, 2-way radios, and camouflage-type netting. It was the kind of stuff you'd normally use to set up a deer or duck blind. Adam almost breathed a sigh of relief when he realized Rich was essentially taking him in to whatever militia force they were going to create. He knew he wasn't the most physically fit guy, but he had enough stuff in his store to supply a small force, and he planned on doing just that. "I'll find out later today what additional stuff we may need, but the one item I'd like you to hold back on would be some .22 caliber rifles and at least 10,000 rounds of ammo for them. We may need them for hunting and potentially trading in a few months, Rich explained. Make sure you keep the survival gear and batteries in the back. I know we'll need those, since we won't be able to get replacements once we fall behind enemy lines. What about ammo, my handguns, or other assault rifles? Adam asked. Should I hold on to those for your people? Rich waved a hand as if to swat away the question. No. Our people all have their own rifles, and most of them have already stocked up on ammo. Let everyone else buy them. Besides, the more people that own them now before the UN shows up, the better. As to ammo, don't bother. We'll be able to take plenty off the dead, and if we have to, we'll swap out our weapons for theirs to make finding new ammo easier. It's some of the other consumable items, like batteries and those other items I gave you, that'll be hard to replace once the occupation settles in. Adam smiled. Thanks for coming down here, Rich. I wanted to help, but I honestly didn't know how. Plus, it's a good thing you got here to claim what you want before I open. I have a feeling most of my store is going to get bought out today. Well, if that's the case, make sure you raise your prices a bit, Rich responded with a chuckle. No reason to have a sale. Besides, hopefully the profits will help cover the cost of everything we're going to need. I don't want to put you in a lurch financially. Adam shrugged his shoulders. That's what insurance is for. Once we get everything we need, we'll make sure the place is looted and firebombed so we can file an insurance claim for a total loss. Rich laughed at Adam's use of air quotes. I'm sure we have some folks who can help with that, to make it legit, he replied with a wink. He stuck out his hand to shake Adam's. Welcome to the team, Adam. I know this is going to be a huge help to have you in the ranks. I've got your back on this one, buddy. The two talked for a bit more until Adam's two other employees showed up. By noon, his place was packed with people trying to buy rifles, ammo, bows and arrows. It was a bonanza of a sales day. Later that evening, Rich and some of his guys showed up with a few trucks. They drove around to the back of the shop and parked near the warehouse. They loaded up the stuff they'd agreed on and then headed out to their headquarters. By the time Adam left the store that night, he didn't have a single firearm left in the place. He estimated he probably had maybe a quarter of his store shelves left with any items at all. He'd stay open another day or two and then close up for good. At this point, it looked like the UN forces might actually be in Toledo to their north in another 2 or 3 days. Chapter 14. Operation Payback. Washington, D.C. White House. Peacock Bunker. Sir, it wasn't a nuclear weapon that hit Raven Rock, reported General Estrada from NORAD. Are you sure? Asked Vice President Powers. Yes, sir. The Chinese bombers hit the bunker with 4 Russian-made father-of-all bombs. Bunker busters? Powers inquired. Correct, Estrada confirmed. They're essentially the Russian version of the American Moab. The Chinese hit all 4 bunker entrances with these thermobaric bombs. They most likely penetrated the bunker and incinerated everyone and everything inside it. Have they found the president? Not yet, sir. Due to the destructive nature of the bombs and the intense fire they created inside the facility, rescuers have been unable to get inside yet. Powers sighed. Well, update me if you have any new information on that front. Yes, Mr. Vice President, Estrada responded. He let out a deep breath. Sir, the other entrance to the tunnel system at Camp David was also hit, and it collapsed. A team of engineers is hard at work, trying to open the tunnel back up and see if, by some miracle, Sachs and his small detail were somehow trapped in the tunnel between the 2 facilities during the missile strike. If that happened, there still might be a chance that they're alive, although, if I'm completely honest, I wouldn't hold too much hope out for that. Understood. They were now 10 hours into the war. General Estrada and General Tibbets spent the next 15 minutes briefing the new acting president on the information that was starting to filter in from across the armed forces. With each contact report and battle update, the big picture of where the enemy was attacking and what strategies they were implementing seemed a bit clearer. Acting President Powers was starting to formulate a response in his head, but he still had so many questions. "General Tibbets, I'm still having a hard time wrapping my head around how the most powerful military on Earth was caught so thoroughly by surprise. What in the world happened?" General Tibbets sighed involuntarily. He obviously wasn't happy about the inquiry. "Mr. Vice President, there are several reasons why this happened. Probably the most important reason is that unlike previous enemies we've fought, this enemy got the first punch in. Per SAC's guidance, we were going to hit the UN force on January 13th, once we had fully deployed a couple more combat brigades near our northern border. My guess, and this is only an assumption right now, is that someone in the military chain or the intelligence community who knew when we were going to carry out our attack tipped Senator Tate's camp off, or told one of their former colleagues who'd defected. In either case, the enemy knew we were going to carry out a preemptive strike, so rather than wait for it, they hit us with their own." Powers felt a rage billowing up inside him, unlike any he had ever experienced before. He clenched his fists. "How did the Navy get caught by surprise like they did?" he demanded. "Sir, given how the events played out today, this plan to install Senator Tate has obviously been in the works for a very long time," General Tibbets explained. "There just isn't any other explanation. With regard to the Navy, it's simple. They had two things going for them. First, the Chinese apparently created a fleet of merchant raiders, similar to what the Germans did during World War II. We've gone over the satellite intelligence and videos from numerous reconnaissance drones and figured out how they did it. Let me share a video with you while I walk you through it." A short video began to play on the screen, and Tibbets narrated while it played. "Okay, sir. So we see here what appears to be a Kenyan-flagged freighter. On the deck of the ship is a single layer of cargo containers, which appear innocuous enough. Then, as you see, half of the cargo containers on the deck slide to the side, like they're attached to a platform or something. And now we can see the string of vertical launch missile pods. In less than 1 minute, the ship fires off 50 land attack cruise missiles. Once the smoke clears, the UAV captures the cargo containers moving back over the top of the VLS system. And again, the ship appears like any of the other tens of thousands of cargo ships that dot the Earth's oceans." With his mouth agape, the Vice President couldn't believe what he'd just seen. "That, Mr. Vice President, is how the Navy and the rest of us were caught flat-footed. It wasn't neglect or arrogance on our part. The enemy had apparently created a completely new weapon we hadn't seen or thought of yet, and ruthlessly deployed it against us. As we speak, we're having the Coast Guard and the rest of DHS work with the NSA to try and figure out who owned the ships that attacked us and who owns these companies. These were Chinese-made CJ-10 cruise missiles, so we know these ships were operated by the Chinese Navy. What we're trying to do now is track down any shell companies that could have been carrying out these attacks, so we can use that information to try and track down any additional freighters that may have been converted into merchant raiders." Rubbing his face out of frustration and tiredness, the acting president looked at the general. "So what are we doing to respond to this attack on our country and the government?" "We have a couple of options. The first is political. The second is military. Let me go over the military first, as I think that's the more important action we need to address." When Tibbets saw that Powers didn't object, he continued. "With the ground war now underway, The UN force is going to burn through a lot of war stocks. They're moving their fleet in the North Atlantic to engage our Navy and attempt to break the blockade. What I'd like to propose is a cruise missile attack by our submarines against the EU's major port facilities in Canada, Europe, and China. This will seriously degrade their ability to support their own naval operations and provide any logistical support to their forces in Canada. My goal is to starve the enemy of supplies. Within 2 weeks, they'll start to run critically short of munitions, fuel, and food. At that point, it won't matter how much ground they'll have captured. They won't be able to hold it, and we'll begin to roll them up and push them back across the border. The VP nodded in approval. He said the other option was a political one. What do you propose? He asked. Since this UN force just tried to decapitate our government, I propose we hit them back and try to do the same thing, Tibbet suggested. Powers couldn't believe it had all come down to this: a tit-for-tat attack on each other's political and military leaders. Had it not been for the death of more than 200 congressional leaders early in the day, the very idea would have repulsed him. But the pundits and talking heads on TV and the American people at large were screaming for blood. They wanted him to retaliate. Fine, General, he consented, crossing his arms. You may proceed, but make sure you hammer them mercilessly. I want a strong political message sent to them. Make sure it hurts. If these nations want to wage war against us, then I want them to know that while the battles may be taking place in America, that doesn't mean we can't or won't hit them back in their home countries. With the decision made, it was now only a matter of time until their response was felt around the world. North Sea. For the past 12 hours, the crew of the USS North Dakota, a Virginia-class attack submarine, prowled the North Sea as they shifted to get into position to carry out the first offensive military action of the war against the nations that had attacked their homeland. Walking into the communications room, Captain John Barry asked a simple question. Any additional updates to our orders? He was still uncertain about the orders they'd received, but they had been verified and authenticated, so he had to implement them. However, that didn't mean he couldn't check every few hours to see if they had been canceled or modified. The 2 enlisted personnel and 1 officer manning the communications room turned and looked back at him. "No change to our orders, sir," replied the lieutenant. He handed the captain a folded piece of paper. "We did get a brief sit-rep from back home that you should take a look at." Captain Barry took the note. Seeing the concern on his LT's face, he remarked, "I take it you already read it." They all nodded and shared some grim looks. "It's pretty bad, sir," said one of the petty officers. Captain Barry unfolded the paper. As he read its contents, his heart sank. Then his anger grew. He shook his head in disgust. Seeing the captain's reactions, one of the petty officers commented, "Yeah, that's pretty much how I felt. The freaking Pentagon and Capitol building," the captain blurted out, speaking to himself more than anyone else. "Read the rest of it," said the communications officer grimly. He looked back down at the message. He felt his fist tighten as he read. The lieutenant in the room couldn't contain himself. "I can't believe they bombed Washington and killed the president. I mean, what the hell were they thinking? Do they really think we're going to take that sitting down?" He smacked his hand on a nearby table. "Now I understand our orders," said Captain Barry. "It's retaliation." He paced back and forth for a moment as he thought. "Okay, guys, I need to get things ready. We're nearly to our launch point. Keep me apprised of any changes in our orders or anything new that comes across the wires. Oh, and this should go without saying, but keep this information private for the time being. I'll make an announcement to the crew following the launch. Right now, I want them focused on our task at hand, not what happened back home. All right, guys?" The captain had asked it as a question, but it was really meant as an order. Seeing their nods, he closed their door and headed back to the control room. When Captain Barry entered the room filled with computers and highly trained men of war, he saw his XO waiting for him. "Sir, we've reached our launch point. We are ready to begin the launch procedures when you're ready." Captain Barry nodded, then turned to his weapons officer. "Let's get this going then," he ordered. "We have a lot of missiles to launch, and I want to do our best to get the hell out of Dodge. God only knows who else is out there waiting for us to make a peep." He felt a bit nervous about the possibility of a German or French sub lurking about. They all knew a German sub had sunk the Truman after slipping past the lead two subs escorting it out to sea. Captain Barry was a bit anxious that his own submarine's technology might not be as advanced as he'd once thought. During the next 10 minutes, the crew of the North Dakota launched their 12 Tomahawk cruise missiles at targets in Paris, Brussels, Germany, and the Netherlands. Their sister ship, the John Warner, also joined the fray to send a message to the UN European partners. When the missiles had launched, Barry let out a sigh of relief. Under his breath, he muttered, "If you want to invade America, attack our capital, and kill our president, we can do the same right back at you, and hit you a lot harder." The Vice President's Operation Payback was now in full swing. Soon the Europeans would be reminded of American might and global reach. 40,000 feet above Beijing. Aboard the Spirit of America B-2 bomber, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Beckman checked their position one more time to make sure they were still on course. Starting about 4 hours ago, they'd been experiencing some navigational problems. It had all made sense when they'd received a message alerting them to the possibility of Chinese or Russian interference with the military's GPS system. Finally, they had a few other ways to make sure they made it to the target and could guide their bombs to their destination. As they ran through the final checks on their bomb, his co-pilot, Reggie, asked, "You really think the president's dead?" "I don't know. It sounds like he is. We'll probably never know for sure. Even if they can get inside the bunker. I heard the bomb pretty much incinerated everyone in it." There was a moment of silence. "So you think they'll get our message after we drop these bombs?" Reggie asked. Turning to look at his co-pilot, Colonel Beckman replied, "Does it matter? We're about to drop 10 bunker buster bombs on the civilian and military leadership of China." They rode in silence for another 5 minutes before their targeting computer told them they were nearly to the drop zone. As they approached the point of no return, they readied their bombs and prepared to unleash America's response to the attack on their government. Beckman saw that they'd reached the drop zone and signaled to his partner to release the bombs. Reggie hit the button that opened the bomb bay doors, and one by one, the 10 5,000-pound GBU-28 bombs fell toward the earth below. They would gain speed with each passing second of free fall until they impacted against a variety of military and government targets across the city of Beijing. Their sister bomber, the Spirit of Texas, also released their 10 bombs, adding to the shock and awe the government of China was about to receive. Unlike previous bombing campaigns against countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, this bombing raid was taking place in broad daylight. With their bombs released, the 2 bombers turned and headed back for home and the waiting refueling tankers off the coast. 28,000 feet above Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Major Clay Williams of the 11th Bomb Squadron looked at the map and saw they were nearly to their launch point. Looking to his right, under the wing, he saw the 2 pods of 3 AGM-158 JASSM-ER, or Extended Range Joint Air-to-Missile Standoff missiles, ready to be released. This was their second bombing mission of the new war. Their first mission had been to deliver a series of cruise missiles aimed at the Canadian ports being used to offload equipment and supplies from Europe. This next round of missiles was being aimed at the Canadian air bases across the province of Ontario. Their squadron was going to hammer the bases at Kingston, Borden, and North Bay, and the Trenton facility, as well as the smaller bases nearby at Canadian Forces Detachment Mountain View and Canadian Forces Station Alert. This would effectively cripple the UN's forward air bases closest to the U.S. border. The bulky B-52H bomber rattled a bit from some turbulence as they flew into another bank of gray clouds. Looking out the windows, Major Williams saw water molecules forming on the window and hit the windshield wipers. "Systems check," he announced over the internal communications system. A flash of lightning off in the distance nearly caused him to jump out of his seat. For a brief second, he thought it was an enemy missile or tracer fire from a fighter plane. He took a couple of deep breaths as he waited for his crew members to go through their checks. A second later, the weapons officer replied, "All weapons show green. We're ready for weapons release." Captain Tim Lee, his co-pilot, looked nervously at him before returning his gaze to the sky around them. "This storm might be more dangerous than we thought," he commented. Major Williams nodded, then turned to look at his co-pilot. "Just keep watching the radars, Lee, and make sure nothing unusual shows up. We're almost ready to head back home and get out of this soup we're flying in." His co-pilot turned to look at him. "I keep envisioning an F-35 popping up out of nowhere and jumping us," Lee said. Major Williams shook his head. "After this mission's done, I don't think we'll have to worry about that." "I sure hope you're right. I still can't believe 4 of our bombers got nailed by a single F-35 yesterday." "It's war, Lee. We're going to take losses. We aren't trailing the Taliban or the Iraqis. This is a modern Air Force that knows what it's doing. Why do you think we're using the ER version of the JASSM this time? It will give more distance between us and the front line. Just stay focused on your tasks, and I'll get us home," he explained confidently. Another minute went by before their weapons officer came over the intercom. "We've reached the launch point. Unless you say otherwise, sir, I'm going to begin releasing our weapons." He smiled. About time, he thought. "Begin weapons release. I want to get us out of here." Seconds later, the ground attack cruise missiles dropped from their wings and internal bomb bay. As each missile was released, its small wings immediately popped out just as the engine ignited. Then it would race on its journey to its pre-programmed target. In the span of a couple of minutes, Major Williams's B-52H bomber released 20 missiles. The remaining bombers in their squadron also released their own JASSM-ERs, adding to the volley of death being hurled at the UN peacekeeping force. It was time to bring the hammer down. The 4 bombers of Zebra flight were doing their best to evade the many Russian and Chinese surface-to-air missile systems, not to mention some former NATO-allied SAMs for good measure, like the venerable Patriot 3 system. If 2 squadrons of F-16 Vipers and F-22s hadn't flown ahead of them, along with a massive cruise missile attack against the enemy air defense systems, they probably wouldn't have made it this far into Canadian airspace, especially given how heavily the Russians and Chinese had saturated the area with SAMs. As it was, their warning systems were almost continually going off. New threats would be identified, and then, as their countermeasures kicked in or the SAM site was attacked, that threat would disappear. The pilot, Major Banks, or Bang Bang to his friends, banked hard to the right hugging the side of another forested area, using the trees and ground clutter for cover. "How did we get stuck being the ones who'd have to overfly the damn runway?" asked First Lieutenant Ricky Porter for the third time. Apparently he hadn't been satisfied with the first two answers that had been given to him. Major Banks groaned. Why did my previous offensive weapons officer have to go and get appendicitis the week before a war started? He asked himself. Ricky had been temporarily assigned to the plane until his other crew member was healthy enough, and he was getting on Banks's last nerve. "Just do your job, Ricky, and get the weapons ready," Banks retorted. "We're nearly to the target. When we come around this next bend, I'm going to slow down a bit as we rise up to 2,000 feet to give us enough room to drop the bombs. Make sure to yell out when they've all been released, because I'm going to light up the afterburners to get us the hell out of there once you've released them all." Ricky grumbled to himself but began to get the weapons ready. He was really green, and he'd only finished offensive weapons officer training a month ago. He hadn't been assigned to a crew yet. Under normal circumstances, he would have flown with a crew on a series of training missions to gain a better understanding of the types of missions he'd be flying. But sadly, that wasn't in the cards he'd been dealt. Their squadron had flown a mission last night, mostly doing this same mission over Ontario, but their bird had been taken out of the mission at the last minute because of a mechanical error. Having missed out on the first mission, Major Banks had been eager to get in on the action. When their squadron commander had asked for 2 volunteers to carry out the riskiest part of the mission, the cratering of the runways, Major Banks had volunteered. He'd figured the other guys had already flown one dangerous mission without him, and it was only fair that his crew fly one of the riskier missions this time. Of course, he hadn't told the rest of the crew that. He'd tell them after the mission was complete. "Okay, here we go," Banks announced over the intercom as he lined them up for their pass over the base. As soon as they leveled out, the whole world around them suddenly filled with red and green tracer fire as thousands upon thousands of projectiles sought them out. "Holy crap, that's a lot of AA!" shouted Marty, the defensive weapons officer. He swiftly did what he could to make sure none of the radar-guided anti-aircraft guns got a solid lock on them. Many lines of tracers crisscrossed the sky, flying at nearly every possible angle like a spectacular laser show. Intermixed with the strings of enemy fire were small flashes of explosions that kept happening at a higher altitude. "We're coming over the runways now," shouted Banks to Ricky. Ricky hit the weapons release button, and the bombs in the internal bay released. All 81 snake eyes strung across the entire runway of the base, their 4-pointed high-drag tail fins opening up to slow the bomb's fall and help angle them to land at just the right position to inflict maximum damage on the concrete slabs of the runway. "All weapons released," shouted Ricky. In a fraction of a second, the 4 30,780 horsepower engines thrust to maximum power, and the bomber banked hard to the left as Major Banks tried to put as much distance as possible between them and the target they'd just bombed. Without warning, the scope in front of Ricky shattered. Sparks flew out, and blood was all over him. Frigid cold air suddenly swirled around inside the cockpit. "We've been hit. I need a damage report," shouted Banks. "Hydraulic levels are dropping. Engine 1 appears to be on fire," his co-pilot exclaimed. "Shut down the engine. I'm going to try and get us some more altitude in case we have to ditch. What's everyone's status?" Banks asked. Everyone called back that they were okay, except Ricky. Banks called out again, but there was no response. "I think Ricky's dead," said Marty. There wasn't too much time to think about that at the moment. The 2 small holes in the windshield brought in more and more cold air, making it uncomfortably frigid in the cabin. Tracer fire still swept toward them, although it seemed that the bulk of the tracers were still focused back at the airfield. Those targeting them seemed to be oblivious to the fact that they'd already gotten out of the area. Then the alarm bells blared, warning them that they'd just been acquired by radar. Seconds later, a string of bright objects flew directly at them. Before Banks could take evasive maneuvers or Marty could get the radar jammed, a string of 30mm projectiles plowed right through the cockpit of the bomber, tearing it apart and killing the entire crew in the process. Moments later, the Lancer blew apart into a massive fireball, its wreckage strewn across several hundred yards of a nearby forest. Canadian Forces Base, Cold Lake. The crew of the SA-19 Grissom sat there for a moment, transfixed, as they heard what sounded like the end of the world happening, not more than 5 or 6 miles away at the large Canadian air base. Dozens upon dozens of anti-aircraft guns fired constantly, while the air raid sirens blared, letting everyone know the base was under attack. Sergeant Kvetskinsky didn't waste a moment. "Get your radar turned back on and start scanning the horizon for possible threats," he yelled. A few minutes went by as they watched the fireworks show. Strings of red and green tracer fire filled the night sky, intermixed with smaller explosions. The defenders were clearly doing their best to throw as much shrapnel and projectiles into the air as possible in hopes that one or more pieces would connect with the bombers, missiles, or whatever it was that was headed toward the base. Then, a much brighter amber burst lit up the base. In quick succession, before they even felt the ground shake or heard the sound of the first explosion, what seemed like hundreds of orange fireballs popped up all across the runways, hangars, and parking ramps of the massive airbase. Soon after, their senses were utterly overwhelmed by the sheer noise of the thunderous explosions, and the ground shook violently from the blasts. "Get ready, here they come," shouted the radar operator inside the vehicle. He steered the turret in the direction of the enemy plane he was tracking. The corporal manning the 30mm machine gun depressed the fire button and sent a barrage of fire in the direction the radar operator had indicated as the source of the threat. No sooner had he fired his first barrage of bullets than they were rewarded with the sight of a massive bomber flying practically straight for them. Sergeant Kvetskinsky watched as the first string of rounds flew right into the nose section of the big bomber. As the first tracer round hit the nose, he knew instinctively that the next 6 rounds would likely be walked right up the nose of the plane and into the crew compartment of the aircraft. The front part of the aircraft began to disintegrate from the sheer speed at which it was traveling and the fact that the cockpit was no longer aerodynamic. Seconds later, the bomber exploded, breaking apart as it crashed into the ground. With his eyes wide as saucers, Sergeant Kvetskinsky realized the burning beast of a warplane was now careening right for them. Before he could yell at the driver to move them out of the way, a wave of debris and fire mixed with fuel engulfed their vehicle and everyone in it. His crew had succeeded in shooting down a B-1 bomber, but they'd also perished in the process. In that last flicker of existence, Kvetskinsky saw a prophetic flash of all of the honors and awards they would receive posthumously in Russia for their gallant efforts. From the Washington Examiner. Nearly 2 days after the UN Army attacked Camp David and the Pentagon's alternate command post at Raven Rock, it still has not been confirmed if President Jonathan Sachs is dead or alive. Spokesmen from FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers have stated that they have a team of specialists working to gain entry into the bombed-out bunker. But it may be days before they are able to confirm if there were any survivors. With the president either dead or incapacitated, Vice President Luke Powers has taken over as acting president. Powers said in a statement to the press that the sneak attack on Washington, D.C., and the assassination of more than 200 congresspersons and senators was a barbaric act that won't go unpunished. He went on to express that he had ordered retaliatory strikes against Russia, China, France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Acting President Powers also asked the remaining members of Congress to issue a formal declaration of war against the nations who are participating in this UN invasion of America. The minority leader, Democratic Congressman Jesus Perez, introduced a war declaration within an hour of that request and has publicly rallied for his caucus and the Republicans to join him in pushing it through Congress. Powers continues to urge people to remain calm across the country, saying, "The American leadership has planned for these types of contingencies, and we do have a plan in place. We are still functioning as a government. Services will continue to be provided, and our brave men and women in uniform are doing everything in their power to defend our great nation. As acting president, I'm asking that all Americans continue to go to work and do their best to carry on with their lives. Please continue to support our law enforcement officials and our men and women in uniform." Powers added, "The Pentagon has announced a plan to increase the size of the military by 3 million service members. If you are physically able and willing to join, I ask that you step forward and help us defeat these foreign invaders." From the New York Times. New Yorkers are torn between their support of President-elect Marshall Tate and his government in exile in Canada and the Sachs administration in Washington, D.C. After the sneak attack on Washington and the killing of more than 200 congressional leaders, 9 of which were from the state of New York, many are uncertain if they still support Senator Tate's decision to involve the UN. Even now, UN military forces are less than 100 miles from New York City. Many who do not agree with the UN mission have begun to flee the city ahead of the advancing army. From the BBC News Online. The world stands collectively aghast at the cruise missile attack carried out against the French capital of Paris during the morning rush hour. At approximately 8:32 a.m., air raid sirens were heard throughout the capital as many Parisians were on their way to work. Without warning, 2 American Tomahawk cruise missiles struck the Élysée Palace, causing immense damage. Fires raged out of control in the building for nearly 2 hours before firefighters were able to contain the blaze. It is reported that the president was not at the palace during the attack, though his wife was, and is presumed to have died in the missile strike. 4 additional cruise missiles struck the Ministry of Defense, often referred to as the French Pentagon. The ports of Marseille, Le Havre, Cherbourg, and Brest were also struck by dozens of American cruise missiles, rendering much of the port facilities useless. According to French defense officials, the cruise missile attacks originated from American submarines operating in the Mediterranean and the North Sea. A massive hunt is currently underway to find and sink these submarines before they can do further damage. British defense officials confirmed that the cruise missile attack carried out by the American submarines was not directed at France alone. American stealth bombers also hit targets in Belgium, bombing the ports of Antwerp and Bruges. Several bombs also hit the Belgian Ministry of Defense building. In the Netherlands, the port facilities of Rotterdam and several railheads were also hit by American stealth bombers. These facilities may have been targeted due to their efforts in support of the UN peacekeeping operations in North America. Germany was also not spared in the overnight raids by U.S. forces. The ports of Bremerhaven, Kiel, and Hamburg saw immense damage. Fires are still raging there as of the time of this publication. American stealth bombers carried out a bold daylight raid against the German, Russian, and Chinese capitals. In Germany, American stealth bombers destroyed the Reichstag and Ministry of Defense buildings. They also hit the Chancellor's residence, thoroughly destroying it. In Russia, American stealth bombers hit the Kremlin and 2 dachas, where the Russian president's family reportedly often stay. It is unclear if he or his family were killed, though it is clear they were the intended targets of the raid. In China, Beijing was rocked by a total of 20 strikes. It has been reported that the Great Hall of the People has been thoroughly destroyed, along with the August 1st building and Zhongnan High Government Residence Complex adjacent to the Forbidden City, where President Chen lives, along with the senior leaders of the Chinese government and their families. It is unclear how many of the leaders of China were killed. One thing has been made abundantly clear by these coordinated strikes. The United States is retaliating for the UN attack on Washington, D.C., and the presumed assassination of President Jonathan Sachs and more than 200 of their elected officials. Nearly one-third of the American federal government was killed during the early morning raid on Washington, D.C., nearly 30 hours ago. Much of the American government is still hiding in their bunkers, unsure if it is safe to return to their normal functions. From Der Spiegel. Norwegian military units under the command of the United Nations have succeeded in capturing the U.S. state of Maine. After some brief fighting with American ground forces in the area, Spanish, Italian, and Belgian troops have succeeded in capturing the states of Vermont and New Hampshire. UN forces have also entered the state of Massachusetts, though they are facing fierce opposition by American Marines stationed nearby. Canadian forces have seized control of the northern half of New York State and have succeeded in isolating the few American forces that were still fighting in Massachusetts and Connecticut. It is believed the UN will capture New York City sometime today, as the American government has declared it an open city to spare it from the fighting. In the Midwest, the elite Dutch-German division Schnellkräfte have broken through the American lines north of the city of Detroit in the state of Michigan. A Russian army group also punched through the American lines in Detroit after heavy fighting within the city. The Russians have now progressed beyond Detroit and captured the city of Toledo along Lake Erie in Ohio. Russian forces are now moving to capture the city of Cleveland as part of their army group splits off to drive on to the capital of Ohio, Columbus. The Schnellkräfte Division is currently engaging the American 1st Cavalry and 101st Airborne Division at Battle Creek, Michigan. When they break through this last line of defense, it is believed they will move to liberate the city of Chicago, Illinois, before expanding further into the center of the country. Fighting between the German and American forces is reported to be fierce and bloody, with little quarter being given to either side. In the West, Russian and Canadian forces have been stopped at the city of Kent, halfway between the cities of Seattle and Tacoma in the western state of Washington. The West Coast states of Oregon and California have announced that they have officially broken away from the United States government, swearing their loyalty to President-elect Marshall Tate, whose government continues to operate in exile in Ottawa, Canada. California's Civil Defense Forces, the state-controlled militia force, attacked and overran Beale Air Force Base, seizing control of much of the federal government's surveillance and drone equipment and capabilities in the process. Heavy fighting is being reported outside Travis Air Force Base in Fairfield, California, just west of the state capital of Sacramento and east of San Francisco. In Southern California, the U.S. Marines have sealed off control of everything from the Mexican border to just south of Los Angeles. It has been reported that there is heavy fighting between the various militia units and renegade California Army National Guard units and the Marines stationed in the area. With critical naval facilities in San Diego and the Marine base at Camp Pendleton, it is no surprise that the federal government has sought to secure the area. Chinese forces continue to arrive in Mexico, threatening the entire southern border of the U.S. It is expected that Chinese forces will begin attacking within the next couple of days. From the Toronto Star. Canadian citizens are appalled at the most recent American attack on Canadian soil. Last night, the Americans carried out a daring deep strike raid, destroying the Canadian Forces base at Cold Lake. It is estimated that over 4,000 military and civilian members were killed during the early morning raid. The previous night, the Americans raided the province of Ontario, destroying all 4 air bases in the process. The Ministry of Defense reports the casualties have now risen to over 7,000 UN forces killed and more than twice that number injured since the start of hostilities. It is unclear at this point how much of the UN's Air Force is still operational after 2 days of heavy aerial fighting. American Special Forces carried out a series of raids, destroying more than a dozen rail bridges connecting eastern and western Canada. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the Chinese ground forces are preparing for a new offensive aimed at capturing Southern California along with the border states of Arizona and New Mexico. With the death of President Sachs by a daring raid on his command bunker, President-elect Marshal Tate has once again made an impassioned plea for acting President Powers to end the bloody fighting and leave office.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.